Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Nick Halper, and he is the founder of Braingrade. You might recognize Nick from Blackrock Microsystems, where he was at before, but now he's gone to Braingrade, which is an implantable Alzheimer's company, and it's still early stages being developed. And so we talk about this a little bit, as well as some of the challenges of going from academia to industry to startup. So he's done all three. Fun interview. We talk a lot, actually. And afterwards, too, we talked about his love of board games, and he's actually a board game designer, and so he's designed a few board games. Nothing, no big ones, but still really cool stuff. He's an interesting guy. So enjoy it. Nick Halper, pleasure to have you on the show. It's kind of funny, we just talked yesterday, but now this is for the actual podcast interview. And people may know you from such places as the Society for Neuroscience at the Blackrock booth, where your face was the size of a person on the side of that booth. So you are here to talk about Blackrock Microsystems, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll talk about whatever you want me to talk about today. But yes, I think I'm still on the side of the Blackrock Microsystems booth. Unfortunately, my face actually had an accident the last year. We packed up the booth. We let one of the booth panels fall over, and my face was crushed in by the corner of a NeuroNexus booth or something. But they reprinted it, and I think my face remains there. So my legacy continues.
Very nice. So you used to work at Blackrock Microsystems. You led up their wearables division, but now you've spun off into your own company, or you're co-founding that right now with some other people. And so you're here to present that, or a little bit announce it. You've already talked about it, but it's kind of more on the investor side of things. So this is an announcement more into maybe the academia side of things. Do you want to talk about Braingrade?
Yeah. So I think this, like you said, this will probably be the first time talking about Braingrade in a non-closed doors setting. Maybe it's probably the best word. I think the first time we talked about them was at the Neurotech Leaders Forum, which you were there for. And then another one was a smaller conference, also on an investing day called Neurotech. So yeah, this will be the first talk to the public about it. But yeah, to give a little bit of background on the company and a little bit of how I got into it. So I was previously, like you said, at Blackrock Microsystems, and I worked my way from a more engineering role into a more product strategy role. And I was really working a lot with the kind of clinical research side of Blackrock and doing some of their med device stuff and working a little bit on contract engineering strategy. And I enjoyed that process so much, working with different clients and helping them spin up out of academia and into some of their first investigational device exemptions and clinical trials. I really just wanted to get a little bit closer to the action and a little bit outside of the making tools for people who make tools part of Blackrock. And I started seeking out med device company opportunities. And one of the ones that showed up was a guy I had met in the previous year. His name is Peter Schlecht. And he comes from he's like a serial entrepreneur, business exec background. And I was coming in from this kind of like med device product background. And it just seemed like this perfect fit after we'd met each other at SFN. And I was talking to him a bit about what he saw in the field. And we were talking about how there were this kind of gap in the market towards devices that actually interacted with cognition. Because when you look at a lot of the brain-computer interface companies out there, whether it's a Neuralink or a Paradromics or even a Blackrock Microsystems, they're focused on getting information out of the brain. So it's this efferent brain-computer interface. And we're really looking at something that could be more internalized, something that could help the brain in processing. And so we saw that gap in the market, and particularly the mission of Peter and the mission of Braingrade is to eventually develop a device that is capable of cognitive enhancement. And we define that in two ways. That would both be enabling people to access information faster or learn information faster, so enhanced learning and uptake, but also potentially even the kind of download a book futurism goal. Now,
The Matrix, I know Kung Fu, right? That's what I'm all about too.
Exactly. And it's a fantasy I think we've all had, if you can push a button and download a book. But yeah, Braingrade as a step towards that direction is taking a medical device step. And when we look at disorders of cognition and those are basically characterized by degenerated or lack of cognition. Alzheimer's disease, I think, is one of the most impactful, both from a numbers perspective and just the impact it has on people's lives and their families. And so Alzheimer's disease is our first target indication that we're going for.
Very cool. So this is like an implantable system. It sounds like pretty invasive, like pretty like deep brain or something like this, or definitely we're going to have to crack open the skull for this, or what's, again, early stages, you don't necessarily want to be giving everything up. But how much can you tell us about this technology?
Yeah. So the device that we're focusing on, or I guess when you think of the target areas, when you think of memory, people think of hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. You have this whole circuit in your brain, the papa's memory circuit. And this device is intended to interact with that circuit. And yes, it's definitely invasive. It's definitely implantable. I mean, I can comment that there are several probes that go into the brain as part of the device's function. So this will be a craniotomy, but it's also a chronic use device, similar to a deep brain stimulator. And so it has a lot of the same kind of form and function as something like the Medtronic Percept or a NeuroPace.
And it also sounds a little bit similar to Neotherapeutics. And we've talked about this in the past with Dan Rizzuto's company. But you said it's also like, it's same but different, as they say in Thailand.
Yeah. When you start talking about implantable devices for memory, because we think about Alzheimer's disease as a memory disorder, and it primarily is, at least especially in the early stages. Definitely you start thinking about neotherapeutics. That said, neotherapeutics is targeting a different indication. So they're going for traumatic brain injury. And I think that's a good follow-on from the study that they did. The DARPA RAM project as a whole, and effectively all of neuroscience uses epilepsy patients as our kind of standard model for human patients, because it's one of the few opt-in elective neurosurgeries. And so that's the place where you can really plan it and sit down and get consent and try to use epilepsy patients as a good way to learn about the brain in humans. And so I think that's a better model for TBI, and Alzheimer's disease is probably a bigger jump. And I think that's part of where that comes from.
Okay, sounds good. So tell us about this company. You had talked to Peter Schlecht and you saw a market opportunity and something. You have a company now. It does sound like a very interesting collaboration, because he's based in Berlin, and then you're in Salt Lake City. You have team members. Do you want to talk about this a little bit? Interesting, something that's very fitting for COVID, I guess.
Oh, yeah. In some ways, I feel like some aspects of this company are defined by COVID, because I left Blackrock Microsystems in approximately March or April-ish of 2020, which was like a really fun time to be starting up a new startup and interacting with Peter, who was halfway around the world. And now Peter had already officially registered this company and kind of gotten the ball rolling. He had thought about this market and opportunity, and I was effectively employee number one. And so I was joining this company that was just like remote only. And that was a cool effect, but also really like strange feeling, because a lot of times when you think of the startup vibe, you think of people like living in like a startup house together or whatever, and they're all just basically like constantly whatever they are doing,
and
jamming out on computers. Yeah. And so it was funny to have a really different feeling to the whole thing. But I also think it opened up some really awesome opportunities, because we've been able to build up such an incredible team of people knowing that they can be where they're at, keep their lifestyle and lives as is, and contribute to something like this that's so awesome. And so I think it removes some of that activation energy and barriers to entry. And it's just helped us produce, I think, just an incredible team.
Yeah, basically you don't have to convince somebody to uproot themselves and go to a different other side of the country, other side of the world. And you can do this with less effort on their end. It doesn't have to be like, hey, we want 40 hours a week or 100 hours a week. It can be like, we want 10 for now, and then we'll see how it goes, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it offers a lot of flexibility, both in how people engage and when they engage. As a remote first company, just like out of the box, you have all of that kind of built-in flexibility. People don't feel that pressure to show up 9 to 5 or 9 to 8 or 7 to 10 or whatever startups want to ask of you. And instead they can really engage on the kind of like time schedule they're feeling, especially given that we were distributed so much geographically. I in Salt Lake City and Peter in Berlin were already 8 hours apart, and you start adding in people from California and Oregon and people in the UK. We did have to draw the line at not letting anybody in from like the other 8-hour segment of the world's time zones, so no Shanghai's. But I think it's made it a really great working environment and a great culture for people.
Yeah, and it's the future. Any tips for that besides not allowing Australians in? We never like them anyways, right?
Yeah, I guess the Synchron can stay where they are or something. We won't be poaching anybody there. I think there's a lot of practices businesses can take when they're looking at asynchronous approaches to work, which is you have to take some asynchronous approaches when you have people so separated in time zones. And asynchronous work is common in really big companies that are global and they're passing on tickets and stuff to each other or whatever across the globe. In a startup, though, I think it's a little less intuitive. That said, I think the focus basically comes down to establishing good routines and buy-in. You want to make people feel like they're part of the action, even though they're all remote. And so setting up good work culture and team meetings that are on a regular basis and getting people engaged and interacting. A really nice smooth chat program is pretty much standard in work these days, but something like Slack or something where people are just really engaged and putting in some kind of casual elements to it. It doesn't have to be all business all the time. So we have good Slack channels for sharing memes and whatever else that we like to share.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah, the most important thing of startup is meme culture.
Yeah. Cool. So you're announcing the company on the Neural Implant podcast. I'm very honored that you come here. So what are you looking to do? Are you recruiting or something like this? Or what are you hoping to gain from this?
Yeah, I guess a lot. First off, I just love talking to you. That's my main gain here. That said, we are hiring. We're hiring into several positions and we'll be posting quite a few more job applications in the coming weeks, but especially right now, we're looking for a head of electrical engineering or electronics development. So we've posted a few that's just barely gone out. I think basically in the last couple of days. So this would be the first kind of public announcement of that as well. Yeah, I would say that's my kind of main engagement, looking for people to join us on this mission.
Very cool. Yeah. So if anybody, anybody who has a neurotechnology background, electrical engineer, or something like this, it sounds like it wouldn't be too hands-on in a lab or fabricating stuff, right? Building stuff, or maybe yes. I don't know.
Yeah, the electrical engineer is probably the one person who really needs to have a facility in hand. A lot of these, your managers and your HR person and your office workers and your regulatory people and your software team can almost all be remote. And obviously they'll have to meet up occasionally, but that electrical engineer and their team is going to need facilities. And so they'll be the one person who's has to be in the office, so to say, and interacting with some of the contractors that we have. But yeah, to their qualifications and to your point, really the specialty and the challenge, I think, for this type of electrical engineering work is implantables. Somebody who's had experience putting devices in a body and kind of operating in that really space and power constrained kind of way is really a whole new ball game, I think, for a lot of people coming out of electrical engineering degrees and things like that. And there's a lot of unique challenges. There's a lot of regulations in place. It's definitely something that needs some care and attention.
What are some challenges in this research, not necessarily just for the electrical engineer, but your company in general?
Yeah, challenges, I would say, first off, a neurodegenerative disorder is an interesting one to tackle. I think some people shy away from it because the brain is technically changing over time. But if it's something that can be addressed in Parkinson's disease, for example, through deep brain stimulation, I believe the same can be true for Alzheimer's disease. And we see that now. There's been some light exploration from physicians into looking at deep brain stimulation for Alzheimer's disease. And I just think that we're going to have the version 2.0 of those devices. And so even though that's definitely a challenge, it's not something I want to brush aside. I do think it's something we can overcome. Otherwise, it's your typical medical device regulatory landscape challenges, right? Regulations aren't always challenges. A lot of times they're guidances, which is actually beneficial and helpful. But at the same time, there's a lot of things you have to do. There's a lot of things you have to test. And really, I think all of that just means you're trying to run up against time. And so it's just like this, it's a really interesting time scheduling puzzle. Maybe that's the biggest challenge.
Interesting. So they're not challenges, the regulations aren't challenges. It's they're trying to help you? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think a lot of people look at standards, for example, and say, oh, there's all these standards I have to comply with. And that's really not the way that standards were meant to be used or thought about. I like to view them a lot more positively, where it's like you look at something like IEC 60601, which defines medical device electrical safety and electromagnetic compatibility. And it's really awesome because it in some ways presents itself as a checklist of, oh, okay, if I want my device to be, compliant with the standard, I just have to make sure that I have air gaps here and that I have leakage currents that meet this value. And when it's implanted, it doesn't exceed this temperature range. Great. Now I have this nice listed definition instead of having to sit there and think in my own team or like banter with the FDA on, whether this is safe enough or not. Being able to just say I comply with the standard is really nice, actually.
Yeah, and you have these engineering constraints right at the outset, and you're like, okay, we have this box that we have to build within. And so that is definitely much easier to do that in the beginning rather than through the development, maybe even prototyping side of things. Yeah, it's a good way. I think it's maybe less emotionally / energetically draining if you look at it in a positive thing, and you're not like fighting the FDA, you're not fighting somebody, you're like working with them. So I like that positive attitude.
Yeah. And it's not even just within the standards. I think exactly like you said, it's within FDA, it's within the notified bodies as well. All of these groups are really open to like discourse and like interaction. And I think a lot of people just underutilize it. And it's really one of the main things that you see. So I don't want to be too critical towards academics who are converting from academia into industry. But by academic-driven companies, I think it's one of the main things they build up in their culture is they see these things as hurdles and barriers, and they don't engage with groups like FDA early enough. You can just write a letter to the FDA and tell them about your projects, basically, and there's a process for it, and they'll get back to you and basically give you feedback on things you should be thinking about. And you can just enter this like back and forth with them. And they're totally open to it, and they love it.
That's cool. Yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, a lot of our listeners are academics and are more in the lab culture and academia culture. And you've done both. Obviously, did a PhD and then went to Blackrock, and now the startup company, which is like a maverick path or something like this. Any advice for this, or are you like completely nutso or something like this? Would you recommend other people to do this, or what's your take on everything?
Nutso for choosing industry. Is that
yeah, exactly. And then leaving a stable job to do something like completely during the middle of a pandemic to do something experimental.
Yeah, for sure. Well,
with some strange German guy.
I guess my first comment on the industry jump from academia, I have to say that the advisors that I had at the time definitely were critical of it. I think more and more academia is tolerant of people moving to industry, and it's not seen as such a negative thing anymore. And I've also seen a lot of back and forth movement. I think there's better and better academia industry partnerships, and it's actually an intersection that I'm hugely interested in on a personal level. But I won't talk too much about that. So I think the field is even now a little more tolerant than it was 10 years ago of that kind of jump. On the subject of leaving a stable job to jump into a early stage med device startup, I think you have to have a good, I guess, like stomach for it, whatever the right like term is. It's definitely not like a feeling of security and a blanket of comfort most of the time. So I think it can be scary, but I think there's a lot of mechanisms in place that can ease that jump a little bit. There's awesome grant and funding programs that can help people make that shift a little more gradually or part-time within kind of an academic framework. And there's great SBAR programs to help support emerging businesses in the US. Of course, we're a German company, so we don't access those types of funding mechanisms. But I think there are ways that you could ease that a little bit. But yeah, I think to you, I wouldn't recommend this path for everybody. It's definitely its own thing.
Yeah, I'm also a little bit like crazy, and I couldn't have the stomach for it. And like, for example, I have Bitcoin, and so you see 20% swings per day, and some people just they can't do that. But I love it. It keeps life interesting. So I definitely like that kind of stuff. And then this is a question I ask sometimes with people, but I think it could be especially interesting for you. If you had unlimited funding, what would you do, or what could you do? What would be your kind of steps after you get unlimited funding?
Wow. Hire everybody. I guess that's like the first step. I really believe in these like kind of huge collectives of people working towards a single goal. And if you could get these kind of really huge teams, I think focusing on something like that and really creating this like tiered approach to development, it would be really awesome. Because I think one of the limitations that you get when you look at grant funded or VC funded companies is that a lot of times they're really linear. And doing parallel development on like version 2 as they're preparing it for the future and stuff is like, why would somebody fund that until they see the results of V1? It's just like too high risk most of the time, but it's the optimal path for a company. And so I think unlimited funding could really help support that like staggered release where you're just putting out new devices that really build on each other in an effective way. But otherwise, in a lot of ways, I'd be doing exactly what we're doing. I really do think that we're pursuing this in the most intelligent and efficient way possible. And while unlimited funding would obviously be awesome and remove a lot of barriers and burdens, I really think that the types of funding amounts that we're interacting with and asking for are nearly optimal, basically, for what it is that we want to do and execute. I think the biggest places that med device companies could really leverage unlimited funding, besides off just awesome facilities and great, tools and not having to wait on
masseuses
purchasing things. Yeah, masseuses, good company culture. But I think another place med device companies could really leverage unlimited funding in general is just in clinical trial parallelization. A lot of the challenges in clinical trials is also related to recruitment, because your device status is basically frozen when you enter your big clinical trials. And it's just a matter of getting enough people in to test it and use it. And for the most part, there's not a lot of tweaking in between patients in later stage trials. And so you really just want to get as many patients at once as you can. But every new site that you establish is a new set of people to train, and it's a new overhead fee and a new hospital system. And it's a lot of burden, and you need more and more clinical trial managers and clinical teams to maintain those. But unlimited funding would let you run that in parallel and go a lot faster.
Interesting. Yeah. I hadn't really heard of that, especially the rolling out of the different products. It completely makes sense. And by doing this kind of serialization and waiting for V1 to come out before V2, what kind of time savings are we talking about? I guess it'd be different over different time frames, but let's say maybe over a 5 or 10-year time frame. Could you cut that in half, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, it depends on what speaking generally, I think it really depends for med device companies on what the kind of what their device is and what the total rollout time of it is, et cetera, which impacts what that wait time is between V1 and V2. But I would say for a lot of med device companies, you're effectively waiting until you have a device on market before you even, and are generating revenue before you even start development on V2 in a lot of ways. Now, the more well-funded ones and stuff can start on V2 basically while they're doing their larger clinical trials. But yeah, you're talking about this could be years of waiting between revisions that really don't have to be happening.
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully you won't be falling down that rabbit hole. You've seen maybe the errors of the others, and you'll be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
I do think that is a strong advantage that Braingrade has. I see us as Rev 2 basically of a lot of these neural interfacing companies that are coming to market today. You basically have all these people who used to be at these new companies in a relatively new industry who've now moved on to Braingrade and are taking the learnings from those companies and finally get into this one. So I already see some great learnings from that being applied.
Yeah, onward and upward, definitely. I think that's not to say that the previous ones are bad, but they can always be optimized, I guess. Yeah, that's really cool. Nick, I think this has been really interesting, very interesting perspectives, and obviously you're announcing Braingrade. I think it's really cool. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I don't. No specifics.
Okay. Sounds good. To remind the listeners, Nick is hiring. And so if you want to be part of the cutting edge of Alzheimer's research and memory enhancement, if you want to learn Kung Fu, Nick is the place to learn that from. So Nick, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and excited to continue talking about this kind of stuff.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.